today we have Isaac from WoodMac, and he has some interesting analysis and research they've been doing on the intersection of DERs and Bitcoin that he's going to give us a glimpse into. Isaac, do you want to take it away?
Awesome. Thanks for the introduction, Duncan, and thank you so much for giving us the opportunity to present. I'm just going to put on a few quick slides. Can folks see my screen?
Yes.
Awesome. So for those who don't know, Wood Mackenzie is a market research firm looking at the global energy transition. I sit within our grid edge team, primarily looking at microgrids, thus the sweater. Recently, I've been looking at a project on Bitcoin mining and how it can support the energy transition, and just wanted to talk through a few key takeaways from that analysis. And yeah, curious to hear people's responses. So the key takeaways in 3 bullet points are: Bitcoin is not a battery, but when you compare it to a battery, you see that it has some features that make it potentially a predictable, reliable, and scalable demand response asset. And there's some interesting opportunities around that. And Bitcoin also has the opportunity to support underutilized generation, and especially stranded natural gas. And so let me just talk through each of those 3 points very quickly. So over the last few weeks, a few folks have talked about Bitcoin being this battery. Bitcoin mining, for those who are not familiar, is basically computers doing lots of computations using a large amount of energy to verify that Bitcoin has been traded. And so it is not a battery in that it can't store energy or discharge it. But the point that these folks are making is really around that it can balance load, and that it has that potential feature. So from this, the larger question is, how can Bitcoin help the energy transition? What we started to look at then is first around demand response. How is it potentially different than traditional demand response assets? The first thing we thought to do is just try to get scale on this question. So for context, we are tracking all wholesale demand response assets. There's about 32 gigawatts of assets currently in programs across ISOs and RTOs. By comparison, we estimate that with Bitcoin, when it was around 58,000, there's about 1.2 gigawatts of demand currently in the US. So these are often in any ranges from 20 to, or maybe 5 to 10, up to hundreds of megawatts, excuse me. And so there's this opportunity that if Bitcoin were to increase dramatically, there might be a very large increase in the scale of Bitcoin mining to dozens or more of gigawatts of capacity. So that's the first point that we thought about, potential of scale for this asset. The second really is what could make it different or more reliable, more predictable than traditional demand response. And there were 4 features that we saw. First is that these assets are operating 24/7, so they can be used at an evening peak, they can be used on a weekend. This is going to matter a lot, especially when you're thinking about some of the recent events in Texas, for example, or some of the rolling blackouts in California. The other thing is that they are highly sensitive to price. One number that stuck out as we were looking through is that that electricity costs account for about 80% of operational expenses of Bitcoin mines in the US. And it varies a little bit based on the cost of electricity and the efficiency of the mines. Also, these systems are doing computations that are non-time sensitive. Because Bitcoin mining is probabilistic, you can think of whether a Bitcoin mine turned off in the middle of the night or during an evening peak, for example, that would be immaterial for the miner. And so they are more flexible than some other types of demand response that might have more time-sensitive processes. And finally, feedback from industry is that there's limited wear and tear in ramping up and down these systems. So this is not just hypothetical. We have seen partnerships between MP2 and Lancium. Layer One, a startup funded by Peter Thiel, among others, had a funny press release about making a 700% profit of doing demand response rather than doing Bitcoin mining in Texas. And so this is the takeaway from this slide, is that if you're doing demand response, especially in low places with low power prices like Texas, there might be an interesting opportunity here to explore for demand response providers, was our takeaway. The other opportunity that we saw was for underutilized generation. Because of Bitcoin mine's sensitivity and cost structure around electricity, they're looking for very cheap electricity. And so a lot of people have said, this is going to be really powerful for getting signed PPAs for electricity, for solar, wind. The issue that we found is that the actual length of those PPAs don't line up. It's important to remember that Bitcoin is only 12 years old. And so signing a 15-year contract with some of the volatility that we see in Bitcoin might be untenable. And what we've seen so far is untenable for the Bitcoin miners where we can find PPA data. So takeaway here is that when we think about the energy transition, we can imagine Bitcoin mines, especially taking on if there's merchant risk for a solar system, for a wind system, that they might sign a 3, 5, even 10-year contract, but they are not likely to sign a PPA. With some of those PPAs getting shorter and more hedging agreements coming into place, they might be an interesting off-taker when thinking about helping for additionality for solar or wind. That's a lot of content. Again, high level, 3 takeaways, thinking about demand response as a possibility, and then underutilized generation is the other possibility for ways that Bitcoin mining in the short term could help the energy transition in the US. Any questions? Or
hey, Isaac, so
yeah.
I think we have time just for one, and there's a great question in the chat around around the capex of Bitcoin mining, because yeah, it's clear energy costs are a really high portion of their opex.
Yeah.
But there's this sort of lack of understanding of whether decreased utilization is even possible, because they have this expensive asset that they need to pay off, and maybe it's out of date after even just a few years. Was there any research into that or anything come on that side of things?
Yeah, so the idea that Bitcoin, and so this maybe comes to the question of, could you use Bitcoin mining for a curtailment opportunity that is only happening relatively infrequently? So the idea that a Bitcoin mine is trying to operate almost all the time is accurate, because they are trying to get the maximum value out of these before they're out of date. The idea that they might be used in short-term demand response events, a few hours over the course of the year, tens, hundreds of hours at most. We have not heard that be a challenge thus far, but this is all still very new.
Hey, Isaac, if you don't mind me jumping in, just to, I agree with the perspective. We've actually started talking to Bitcoin miners, because as a retail electricity provider that actually does demand response as well, we're trying to structure power contracts for flexible demand resource customers, Bitcoin miners being a very interesting case for that. Yep. And what we've heard is on the high end, like 400 hours per year of curtailment they're comfortable with. So that's like 95% uptime. Yep. And I've heard as low as actually 80%. So as far as like the utilization factor that they need in the actual miners we've spoken with have been like 80 to 95%. And you could even think of it as like, if you can, in that section, like if your lower utilization during the pricier times is going to lower your all-in cost of power, there's like an optimization curve there in a way of the right downtime, leading to higher OpEx, like the layer one leading to better, like lower OpEx actually, like the layer one article you mentioned where they said it was a 700% profit in that time. So anyways, it's just my 2 cents is we've heard like 80 to 95% from miners themselves.
Yeah, no, that aligns with what with some of the things we've heard on the demand response opportunity.
Cool, Isaac. If anyone's interested in this work that you're doing at WoodMac on this, how can they learn more?
I will put my email in the chat for folks who want to reach out. I'm also on Twitter at imaze13. But yeah, I'll put my email in the chat for anyone who has follow-up questions.
Very cool stuff, man.
Thanks, guys.